They laughed at his old shoes until he walked into the bank he owned. They pointed at his worn-out shoes, sneering as if he didn't belong. The scuffed leather, the broken laces, all screamed poverty to them. What they didn't know was this: the man they laughed at owned the very bank they were standing in. The downtown plaza bustled with its usual Monday chaos. Office workers rushed with coffee cups. High heels clattered against marble floors, and the smell of roasted beans and city air mixed in the autumn wind. At the corner of Main Street stood a man in shoes so worn they looked older than the buildings themselves. The leather was cracked, soles uneven, and the laces frayed beyond repair. He walked slowly, every step echoing humility, but those who noticed saw only weakness. A group of well-dressed young men, their ties sharp and polished shoes gleaming, spotted him crossing the marble lobby of Sterling National Bank. They smirked, whispering among themselves, "Look at those shoes. Did he crawl out of the 80s? One chuckled, probably begging for change. Another scoffed. They laughed loud enough for him to hear, and people around began to glance over with subtle smiles. The man did not react. He kept his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the world pressed on him. To the crowd, he was just another poor soul who didn't belong in a place where millionaires move their fortunes. But appearances deceive, because this man wasn't poor. He wasn't lost. He wasn't desperate. This man, Daniel Carter, was about to walk into the very bank he secretly owned. Daniel Carter walked slowly, but with purpose. His head was slightly bowed, and his lips pressed into a firm line. Every sound of his tattered soles against the glossy floor made heads turn. The lobby of Sterling National Bank gleamed, golden chandeliers, polished counters, and the scent of power hanging thick in the air. At the far end, security guards exchanged quick looks. They had seen men like him before, desperate faces, eyes searching for mercy, hands begging for credit that would never be granted. But Daniel's eyes were different. They carried something few could recognize: ownership. The group of young men who mocked him earlier whispered again, watching. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit, laughed loud enough for others to hear. "Somebody should tell him Goodwill is down the street," he sneered. Daniel glanced at them, just once. His piercing gaze silenced a mockery for a moment. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at them, calm, unbothered, as though he already knew how their story would end. He reached the enormous glass doors of the inner offices. Two guards instinctively stepped forward to block him. "Sir, this area is restricted." Daniel said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket. For a moment, the crowd held its breath, unsure what he was about to reveal. Slowly, he pulled out a small, polished key card, one with an insignia few people in the city ever saw. The guards froze. Their expressions shifted instantly, from suspicion to respect. "Of course, Mr. Carter," one muttered, stepping aside. The laughter in the background died. The group of young men stared, confused. Mr. Carter? They thought. Why would the guards address this poor-looking man with such authority? Daniel slid the key card through the scanner. A green light flashed. The glass doors unlocked with a heavy click. He stepped inside, not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as a man walking into what already belonged to him. What no one in that lobby yet realized was that Daniel Carter wasn't here to ask for a loan. He was here to remind the world who truly held the keys. The moment Daniel Carter stepped past the glass doors, the energy inside Sterling National Bank shifted. This was no ordinary hallway. The air smelled of power, leather-bound chairs, polished mahogany desks, and walls lined with oil portraits of past presidents of the bank. Phones rang in steady rhythm. Assistants rushed between offices, and the controlled hum of business flowed like a hidden current. But when Daniel entered, everything wavered. His shoes squeaked softly against the polished wooden floor, a sound so out of place in this temple of wealth that heads instinctively turned. At first, a few executives sneered. They saw the same thing everyone else had: a poor man who didn't belong. That changed the moment the two security guards closed the doors behind him. Not with dismissal, but with precision and respect. A young secretary nearly tripped over her heels as she rushed forward, her face drained of color when she recognized him. "Mr. Carter," she whispered. almost breathless. We weren't expecting you today." The room froze. The name spread in murmurs like wildfire. Carter? Eyes widened. Some whispered in disbelief. "Is that him?" The Carter? The one who... From the far corner office, a tall man with slick back hair and a crisp suit emerged. Raymond Hale, the bank's acting CEO. His polished smile flickered when he saw Daniel. "Daniel," Hale said cautiously, "this is unexpected." Daniel's gaze lifted. His eyes, sharp and calm, swept the office like a silent storm. He smiled faintly, the smile of a man underestimated one too many times. "I thought it was time," Daniel said slowly, "that I reminded everyone who truly owns this place." The words hit like thunder. The whispering grew louder, frantic, like sparks feeding a flame. Many had heard rumors that Sterling National had a hidden majority owner who never appeared in public, who stayed invisible while others played figurehead. But none expected that man to walk in wearing shoes with broken soles. Raymond Hale forced a laugh, though his voice cracked ever so slightly. "Well, you've certainly made an entrance." Daniel glanced down at his battered shoes, tapping one against the hardwood floor. The hollow thud echoed in the silent room. "Funny thing about shoes," he said. "People think they tell you where a man stands, but they rarely see where he's going." Without another word, Daniel brushed past Hale. The staff parted for him, stunned into silence, as he pushed open the tall doors of the boardroom. What he was about to say behind those doors would change everything. The boardroom of Sterling National Bank was a fortress of power. A massive oak table stretched across the length of the room, polished so finely it reflected the glow of the chandelier above. Around it sat men and women, in immaculate suits, their pens poised, their papers stacked neatly in front of them. When the doors creaked open, all heads turned. Daniel Carter stepped inside. His shoes, with their cracked leather and uneven soles, left faint scuffs on the pristine floor. To these directors, accustomed to luxury, perfection, and appearances, he looked like a ghost from another world. Raymond Hale followed quickly, his smile rehearsed but his eyes uneasy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "allow me to introduce..." But Daniel cut him off. His voice was calm, firm, and impossible to ignore. No introduction needed. The room fell silent. A faint hum from the overhead lights was the only sound. Daniel moved ahead of the table, pulling out the chair that had remained empty for years, the seat reserved for the true owner of the bank. The directors exchanged uneasy glances. A woman in a gray blazer leaned toward a colleague, whispering, "Is that him? The Carter?" Daniel rested his hands on the polished wood, his eyes scanning each face one by one. "I built this bank when no one believed it could rise. I stayed in the shadows because power works best when unseen. But today," he paused, letting the silence stretch. "Today, I'm reminded why shadows are necessary. Because when people see only your shoes, they laugh. But when they see the ground beneath your feet belongs to you, then they fall silent." Several directors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Raymond Hale attempted to interject, his tone laced with forced authority. "Daniel, with all due respect, we've been managing just fine without." "Without me?" Daniel's voice was sharper now. "This bank exists because of me. Every dollar traded, every loan signed, every vault filled. It all began when I staked everything I had down to these very shoes." He lifted his foot slightly, the sole worn thin. The gesture was simple but devastating. The room's silence deepened. "You sit here dressed in silk," Daniel continued, his voice steady, "forgetting that fortunes aren't made in comfort. They're made in sacrifice. And these shoes carried me through that fire." The directors lowered their eyes, some with guilt, others with fear, but none dared laugh. Daniel leaned back, his presence filling the room. "From this day forward," he said, "no decision leaves this table without crossing me first. Sterling National is no longer a bank led by appearances. It is a bank led by truth." The silence that followed wasn't just respect. It was surrender. The boardroom's silence lingered, but Daniel's mind drifted. His hand rested on the polished oak table. Yet his thoughts traveled decades back, to a time when the word bank was nothing more than a distant fantasy. He remembered the dirt roads of his childhood, the small town where opportunity was as scarce as rain in summer. His father was a factory worker, his mother a seamstress. Together, they barely scraped by. Dinner was often bread and water, and shoes, real shoes, were a luxury. Daniel's first pair wasn't new. They were hand-me-downs from his older brother, already cracked and loose at the seams. He wore them until his toes poked out and the soles flapped like tongues against the pavement. Other children laughed at him as he walked to school. "Nice shoes, Carter," they jeered. Some days, the shame burned hotter than the summer sun. But Daniel never stopped walking. At 14, he worked odd jobs, sweeping shop floors, carrying crates, shining the shoes of men who mocked his own. With every coin he earned, he saved a little, not for new shoes, not for comfort, but for books. Books about business, about money, about building something bigger than the world had offered him. Nights were long. By candlelight, Daniel studied page after page, his old shoes resting beside him like silent witnesses to his hunger for more. His friends spent evenings in the streets, but Daniel filled notebooks with plans, calculations, and dreams. By 21, he scraped together enough to start a tiny lending service. Just a wooden desk, a ledger, and 2 chairs. His first clients were farmers too poor to get loans from the big banks. Daniel didn't care about their dirt-stained boots or worn-out clothes. He saw something others didn't: potential. And when they paid him back, every penny, every dime, he realized something. Trust, not wealth, was the foundation of banking. The years rolled on. Daniel reinvested every coin. His office grew into a branch. That branch multiplied. And as Sterling National Bank slowly rose from obscurity, Daniel kept one promise to himself. He would never replace those old shoes. They were his reminder, his anchor, his symbol of where he began. And now, decades later, those same shoes had carried him from the dirt roads of childhood to the head seat of one of the most powerful banks in America. Daniel's eyes snapped back to the boardroom. His directors still stare at him in silence, unaware that his ragged shoes weren't shameful, they were trophies. The boardroom was silent, but beyond those polished walls, whispers slithered through the city like snakes in the grass. Daniel Carter's rise had not gone unnoticed. For every farmer he had once helped, for every small business he had lifted, there were powerful men who cursed his name, competitors who lost market share, politicians who couldn't buy him, bankers who hated that the man in tattered shoes had outsmarted their tailored wealth. In a smoke-filled lounge across town, 3 men gathered. Their suits were sharp, their watches heavy with diamonds, but their voices carried the tone of desperation. "This Carter thinks he can waltz back in and take control," one spat, slamming his glass onto the table. "He's dangerous." Another leaned forward, his face shadowed by the dim light. "The problem isn't his money. It's his story. People love him, the poor man who rose from nothing. That makes him untouchable in the public's eyes." The third man, older and calmer, lit a cigar. The smoke curled upward like a phantom. "Then we don't touch him in the public's eyes," he said slowly. "We ruin him from inside." Quietly, like rot in the foundation, they clinked their glasses together in agreement. And just like that, the war against Daniel Carter began. Not with bullets, not with open attacks, but with shadows, secrets, and betrayals. Back at Sterling National, Daniel sensed it. Years of hardship had sharpened his instincts. He knew the world never applauded without plotting. The same men who shook his hand in daylight would stab it in darkness. That evening, he sat alone in his office, the city lights glowing beyond the glass wall. His shoes rested on the edge of the desk, battered but proud. He stared at them, remembering the laughter of those boys on the dirt road long ago. "They'll laugh again," he murmured to himself. But not for long. Because Daniel Carter understood something his enemies never would. Power built on wealth was fragile. Power built on survival was eternal. And survival was the one thing he knew better than anyone. The weeks that followed Daniel's return were tense. Every board meeting ended in silence. Every hallway whisper carried weight. Sterling National Bank was thriving, but beneath the polished marble floors, cracks were forming, and Daniel knew where to look. Raymond Hale, the acting CEO, had always been ambitious. For years, he had run the bank in Daniel's absence, making himself comfortable in the spotlight. When Daniel returned, Raymond played the loyal subordinate, shaking his hand in public, calling him sir in front of the staff. But loyalty spoken in daylight often dies in darkness. Late one evening, long after most had gone home, Daniel entered the boardroom to retrieve a file. What he found instead was Raymond, sitting with two directors, their voices hushed and urgent. "We can't let him run this place like it's his kingdom," one director hissed. "He is the kingdom," Raymond replied coldly. "But even kings can fall." Daniel didn't move. He stood in the shadows, listening as a man he had once trusted spoke with venom. "We leaked the documents," Raymond continued. "His early loans, the risks he took, the losses he buried. If the public sees him not as a genius, but a gambler, they'll turn against him. Investors will panic. His empire will crumble." The others nodded. The plan was set. Daniel stepped back quietly, his heartbeat steady but heavy. Betrayal wasn't new to him. It was stitched into his life like the cracks in his shoes. But betrayal from within, that was different. That cut deeper. The next morning, Raymond greeted him with his usual polished smile. "Good to see you, Daniel. Ready for another productive day?" Daniel looked down at his old shoes, then back into Raymond's eyes. His expression was unreadable, but inside his resolve hardened. If Raymond thought old shoes meant weakness, he was about to learn the truth. Worn soles don't break easily. They endure. And Daniel Carter had endured far worse than betrayal. The morning newspapers hit the stands with headlines that cut like knives. Sterling National built on risky loans. Carter's fortune, genius or gambling? Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into doubt. Investors shifted nervously. Clients withdrew funds. For the first time in years, Sterling National trembled. Raymond Hale sat in his office, sipping scotch at 9 a.m., his smile wide. The leak had worked. He imagined Daniel Carter's humiliation, the board's panic, and the empire slipping into his hands. But across town, Daniel was calm. He sat at a diner in his usual booth, his old shoes crossed under the table. While the city buzzed with scandal, Daniel read the paper without flinching. A waitress, noticing the headline, whispered nervously, "Mr. Carter, is it true?" Daniel folded the paper neatly and looked her in the eye. "Truth," he said, "isn't written in ink. It's written in the results." And with that he stood, paid in cash, and walked out, each step of his battered shoes echoing like defiance. Back at the bank, the board called an emergency meeting. The room was thick with tension. Directors demanded answers. Raymond, playing the savior, stood tall. "Ladies and gentlemen, we must face facts. Carter's methods are reckless. If we want to save Sterling National, we need stability, leadership that doesn't hide in the shadows." Several nodded in agreement. The trap was working. But then the doors opened. Daniel walked in, the same man in the same old shoes. No lawyer, no entourage, just himself. The murmurs died instantly. He placed a single leather-bound ledger on the table. "This," he said, his voice calm, "is the truth." The directors leaned in. Inside the ledger were decades of records. Every loan, every repayment, every investment. The same risks Raymond had painted as recklessness were, in reality, proof of genius. Farmers who had become landowners. Small shops that had grown into franchises. Families who had built legacies. Daniel's voice grew sharper. "They call it gambling because they don't understand sacrifice. They call it risk because they've never walked in shoes like these." He lifted his foot slightly, the cracks so visible. "But while they mocked, I built. And this bank stands not on luck, but on lives changed." The boardroom was silent. Raymond's face paled. His plan was unraveling. Daniel leaned forward. "The storm you fear isn't in this ledger. The storm," he said, his eyes locking on Raymond, "is betrayal. And storms always wash away the weak. Numbers, fabricate doubts, and leak poison into the press." Daniel's voice cut through the shock. "The storm wasn't born from my risks. It was manufactured by him." He pointed at Raymond, his tone firm but calm. He wanted to burn Sterling National to the ground, just to bury me in the ashes. The directors erupted in outrage. You jeopardized the bank? One barked. You betrayed all of us, shouted another. Raymond stood, panicked. Lies. Forged documents. You can't believe this. But the desperation in his voice betrayed him more than the evidence ever could. The chairman slammed his gavel on the table. Enough. Raymond Hale, your actions have endangered the integrity of this institution. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your position. Your shares are frozen pending investigation. Security stepped forward. Raymond's face was drained of color. You can't do this. I made this bank strong. You'll regret this. His words bounced hollowly against the walls. Daniel rose slowly. He didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. Instead, he walked closer, his cracked shoes scuffing against the floor. Looking Raymond dead in the eyes, he said, quietly, you thought these shoes made me weak. You thought humility was a disguise for failure. But while you built enemies, Raymond, I built foundations. And foundations don't fall. The guards escorted Raymond out, his footsteps loud but powerless. Outside, the sky had opened, rain drumming against the windows. It sounded almost like applause for Daniel, who stood steady while betrayal collapsed around him. For Raymond, the storm was the end. For Daniel Carter, it was only the clearing of skies. The storm had passed. Raymond Hale was gone. The scandal laid bare, and Sterling National stood stronger than ever. But for Daniel Carter, triumph wasn't measured in boardroom victories. It was measured in footsteps. Weeks later, the city gathered for the bank's centennial celebration. The ballroom glimmered with gold chandeliers, polished marble, and the hush of expensive suits. Guests whispered, waiting for Daniel's speech. The man who had risen from rags of riches mocked his shoes, now owning the very bank that had once shut its doors on him. Daniel stepped onto the stage. Cameras flashed, but he didn't look for them. He looked down for a moment at his shoes, still scuffed, still cracked, still carrying the dust of his journey. He began softly. When I was 17, I walked into this bank to ask for a loan. They laughed at me. They laughed at my clothes, at my accent, at my shoes. To them, I was just another dreamer who would never matter. The room was silent, but every laugh was fuel. Every rejection was a reminder. And every step in these shoes carried me closer to truth they could never take away. Fortune is not built by wealth. It is built by will. He held up the ledger once more, the same one he had shown the board. This ledger doesn't hold numbers. It holds people, families who rose from poverty, businesses that grew from corners into empires, generations who built a future. His voice grew steadier, stronger. Money buys comfort, but it doesn't buy respect. Respect is earned step by step. And if you mock the shoes of a man climbing, don't be surprised when he reaches the top and you're looking up. The audience erupted in applause, not polite clap, but thunderous, heartfelt cheers. Some stood, tears in their eyes. Later that night, as the ballroom emptied, a young boy nervously approached Daniel. His shoes were torn, his laces broken. He looked up and whispered, Mr. Carter, do you think someone like me could own a bank one day? Daniel smiled gently, crouched down so their eyes met, and tapped his own shoes. Son, he said, these shoes once looked just like yours. Don't let them laugh you out of your dream. Every step counts. Every step matters. The boy's eyes widened, hope sparking like fire. And as Daniel walked away, his old shoes echoed across the marble, no longer mocked, no longer ridiculed. Now they were a legend. If this story touched you, imagine the story still ahead. Don't just leave with a lesson. Leave with a journey. Hit subscribe and join us for the next chapter.